All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to a special edition of Transformation Tuesday. My name is Jerry Hawkins. I'm the Executive Director of Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation. Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation's mission is to create a radically inclusive city by addressing race and racism through the TRHT framework, which includes narrative change, relationship building, and equitable policies and practices. Our vision is a city that has no North and South divisions in terms of race, culture, arts, health, and that we are constantly, continuously, and actively healing from our present and past inequities. Very excited today about the conversation about transgender lives in our communities. As you all know, in Texas, transgender people are under attack. And so I am excited to bring my community partner and colleague, X, to talk about their work. X is a Dallas, Texas native, artist, poet, facilitator, community organizer, working in Black and Indigenous, people of color, queer and trans advocacy, design justice, social justice, and youth-centered art programming. They use their artistic and technical skills to illuminate our shared interests and dedication to unlocking our community's creative potential and craft the futures we want to see. They are the founder and co-director at House of Rebirth, a transitional center for transgender people in Dallas, Texas, where they work with young adults and youth of color, enhancing their life journeys. X enjoys working hands-on with young people, creating liberating spaces that nurture imagination and challenge the status quo towards youth visions for tomorrow. They also believe deeply in youth agency and autonomy as fundamental in cultivating youth resources. Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation has worked with X and House of Rebirth before in supporting House of Rebirth, and also during 2020 in a conversation directed at Black men and what we can do to protect transgender communities. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to one of the most brilliant minds in Dallas, X.
Hello. So good to be here. Thank you so much, Jerry. I'm excited about this opportunity, excited about what we are going to be discussing and talking about today. And I just wanted to go ahead and get us started with some grounding exercises. I think you always need to open up a space with some breath, some water, and some thoughts. And so I just wanted to let everybody who is in the audience, give them an opportunity to do that. Just take 3 deep breaths. And just center yourself. If you've got some water or a beverage or some tea or something, go ahead and drink that and ground yourself. Open your heart and your mind. The information, the things that we are going to be discussing today might be jarring to some folks. There might be some things that trigger us, that make us feel uncomfortable or afraid. And I think that in that instance, it's always good to recognize and believe that we have everything that we need. And that's within our communities and within ourselves. And that together we can do just about anything. And I think that the story of House of Rebirth, I think the story of my own experiences in organizing and activism in Dallas and across the country has been proof of that. And so I'm going to be sharing with you some information about how that all has come to be. So like Jerry said, my pronouns are they and them. My name is X. I am one of the founders at House of Rebirth, and I'm also a youth program manager and a dozen other things, right? But within that, I'm an artist. And so I like to bring art and expression to everything that I do. And so there will be a little poetry in here, as well as some conversations around how it is that we create community and the creative design of that. This is the table of content, some of the things that we can expect to learn about today. The first thing that we'll start on is our language and definitions, understanding what is gender diversity. Then we'll be going into a global and historical perspective, looking into what gender was pre-colonial times across the globe. And we'll go do a deep dive into what's happening in Texas for transgender folks, transgender young people, Black trans women, all of us, what that has looked like over the last 20, 30 years, and also what it's looking like now. And then at the end, we'll be discussing some tips on the importance of inclusion in home, work, school, and community. And finally, I'll be sharing with you a poem called Unavailable. So, what is gender? A lot of us feel like we know exactly what that means because we think of it as this very rote and understood concept. But many of us would be surprised to know that our concepts of gender, especially in the United States, are limited by the way that we even conceive gender in the Western world as in the first place. So let's get a good working definition of what gender is. According to Berkeley Centers for Educational Justice and Community Engagement, gender is a socially constructed system of classification that ascribes qualities of masculinity and femininity to people. Gender characteristics can change over time and are different between cultures. So you should see gender identity and gender expression for more information on that. Next, we're going to go through some more specific definitions, and these are some things that we'll likely be discussing during this presentation, and will help you to kind of have a working knowledge of what is to come. So this list is not exhaustive, but it can be a helpful tool in understanding what certain terms are referencing. So sex is different than gender, and that is specifically referring to the combination of gonads, chromosomes, and secondary sex characteristics, hormone balances, but is generally limited to what the doctor assumed your sex to be at birth. So the terms that are usually used for this are male, female, and intersex. And so the sex that somebody is assigned at birth sometimes frames and informs what their later social interactions look like. The next one would be cisgender. You heard somebody say, are you cis? It's not SIS, it's CIS. And cisgender simply describes people who do identify with the gender with the sex that they were assigned at birth. Next would be your gender expression. This refers to all the external characteristics and behaviors that are socially defined as either masculine or feminine, like the way that you dress, the way that you groom yourself, speech patterns, and social interactions. But your gender identity, however, is your individual and internal sense of your own gender, whether you identify with the gender that you were assigned at birth, another gender, or no gender at all. And the alphabet mafia is here to stay. We add letters every year, but we're just gonna do the LGBTQ, which stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer. And that plus is for all those other alphabet letters. And that signifies ones that might identify with a sexual orientation or gender identity that is not represented in this acronym. A lot of folks use the term LGBTQIA+ or LGBTQ+ to speak about that entire group and community. And we'll be using it a bit as shorthand here as well. So what is intersectionality? Well, first, I would like to start with saying that I understand race to be a social construct similar to gender, with its synthesis in Europe in the 17th century as a systematic method of class ordering with no scientific basis. So in this presentation, where the term racialized Black is not used and Black is used, it is for shorthand, as the realities of being racialized are still relevant and effective. So when we talk about intersectionality, It refers to the cumulative ways that the effects of multiple forms of discrimination like racism, sexism, and classism combine, overlap, or intersect, especially in the experiences of marginalized individuals or groups. Now, this concept was initially introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw. She introduced this theory, and it's the idea that when it comes to thinking about how inequalities persist or how things continue to go on, that these categories like gender, race, and class help us better to understand the reasons why. And it also helps us to understand them as constitutive rather than isolated and distinct. I really like this graph or this little circle thing on the side where it says mind, body, and spirit. It lists a lot of the different ways that a person's identity can have intersections, from politics to socioeconomic status, healthcare systems, if they're experiencing homophobia or transphobia, etc. And on the right side, you'll see an image of some of our trans ancestors who have passed through unfortunate deaths and killings. And the reason why I use this image is because from Tony McDade to Rhea Milton, intersectionalities help to inform how it is that they ended up in some of those situations. The intersections of race and gender. So from Kimberly Crenshaw herself, she says that intersectionality is about capturing dynamics and converging patterns of advantage and disadvantage. And those are going to change from context to context. Now, many of us have heard this term intersectionality. It gets thrown around, and she even mentions it on a podcast that since it's become popular, that people think of it as simply an identity sweepstakes, something where you get a count or a number after you've added up the total of your oppressions, an intersectionality badge, if you will. But she says that this is actually not what she created this framework for, but that it's a way of thinking about discrimination that changes it from a flattened place that says race and discrimination might be the same for everyone, and helps us to see how it can look different for different people. So Janet Mock is pictured here at the bottom, and she says, for me personally, politically, there is no separating my womanness, my Blackness, from my transness, from my me-ness, as in the things that she's experienced in her life have been compounded by all of these facts, and that for her, it just simply doesn't make sense to try and separate them. I think of it as a method of understanding the complexities of oppression within a community, more so than a framework for an individual appraisal. We understand that those outcomes or those experiences can affect outcomes.
The impact is off.
And are a matter of life and death for those deepest in the margins. So that's what we'll be discussing today. Next, we're going to look at a slide with someone, her name is Ashley Marie Preston. She's a media personality, a writer, speaker, civil rights activist. And she's also one of the first people to run for, or first trans people, openly trans people, to run for California State Assembly District 54 in 2018. She's going to be discussing intersectionality and allyship and why it matters. And also some of the things that we need to start with before we can even get to the point of allyship.
The impact is often a dismissal of feelings and an invalidation of experiences. When we run people off the road in our welcome wagon, what we're really saying is get over it. You think you're the only one who knows what it's like to suffer, experience pain? You're not. I know what that's like. And there was absolutely no one there to console me. So why should I console you? This subconscious messaging springs forth from the depths of apathy, and it impedes our capacity to bridge gaps, initiate constructive conversations, sync our similarities, and build alliances. There were moments in which I often talk about the growing threat of violence toward Black trans women whose life expectancy is between the ages of 30 and 35 years old. And I've had my pleas for support shut down by those not taken into consideration.
I'm sorry. Okay.
The impact is often a dismissal of feelings and an You think you're the only one who knows what it's like to suffer, experience pain? You're not. I know what that's like. And there was absolutely no one there to console me. So why should I console you? This subconscious messaging springs forth from the depths of apathy, and it impedes our capacity to bridge gaps, initiate constructive conversations, sync our similarities, and build alliances. There were moments in which I often talk about the growing threat of violence toward Black trans women whose life expectancy is between the ages of 30 and 35 years old. And I've had my pleas for support shut down by those not taking into consideration that every single day I have to navigate trans misogynoir, which exists at the intersection of transphobia, misogyny, and anti-Blackness. Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw introduced the theory of intersectionality in 1989, explaining that identity markers don't exist independently of one another, but that each informs the other. Simply put, intersectionality describes multiple threats of discrimination when an individual's identities overlap with multiple minority groups. That was really hard for me to communicate to a lot of my friends who are would-be allies in the field. Because while we all have similarities as we experienced in the exercise in the beginning, we also have differences. And in a society fraught with trauma and so deeply fragmented, how do we align ourselves with one another in a way that heals old wounds and makes us stronger as a society? Sometimes we have to take a moment to just pause and examine ways of being effective allies to one another. So in order to establish effective allyship, first, pinpoint your intentions. What's the real reason you consider yourself an ally? It's important to know this because when you're dragged out of your comfort zone while trying to understand someone from a different walk of life, your intentions will be your motivation to stay the course. There are often times that we've really convinced ourselves deep down inside that we have the best intentions at heart. I've had people invite me as a Black trans woman into spaces to talk about my experiences, only to have me be a puppet to their own messaging so that they could go home and feel better about themselves and not feel the call to action to be better allies. Absolutely not. I've had people in certain spaces who are what I refer to as being diet woke. All the instant psychological gratification of moral correctness without the aftertaste of commitment and zero guilt. And so when we look at our intentions, it holds us accountable not only to the space, not only to others, but it also helps us reach our end goal. The next thing is to acknowledge that disproportionate realities exist. Acknowledgement without action is aided abetment. If we aren't actively working to dismantle all systems of oppression simultaneously, we're passively sustaining them. Many people have a difficult time with that one, myself included, because it means that we have to put ourselves aside and acknowledge different experiences. And it's in our nature to subscribe to this single slice ideology that if you get yours, then I can't possibly get mine. And we start lining up our forms of oppression and our experiences in numerical order. And we practice turns front of the line, back of the line. But what if I told you that we can all be allies on our own individual quest toward liberation? In fact, our support of one another is contingent upon acknowledging other people's experiences. We are of a collective palate, and none of us will taste liberation until we all do.
So that was Ashley's take on intersectionality and allyship. And I think it's so important that folks who are being called in the conversation, are being spoken about within conversations, are leading them and are discussing the issues that they're experiencing and that they feel. And so when she speaks about the importance of knowing your intentions, knowing why you are doing this work, that'll be the catalyst and the drive that allows you to move on and move forward. I think that those are words of absolute truth. And so as we move forward, we're going to be learning about gender diversity and colonialism. A lot of the things that we know about gender are not necessarily true, and they impact the ways that gender, race, all of these different things intersect. Did you know that on nearly every continent, and for most of all of recorded history, thriving cultures have recognized, revered, and integrated more than two genders? Terms like transgender and gay are actually new constructs that assume three things: that there are only two sexes, male and female, and as many as two sexualities, gay and straight, and only two genders, man and woman. But when we look at this map, which I got from PBS, I'll make sure that it's in the resource document. We find that there is a gender diversity all across the globe. And so this is a screen share of some map looking that I did. We looked at Ethiopia and learned about the Mal people of Southern Ethiopia and the ways that they understood gender, and also some of its impacts after Protestant missionaries in 1970s. The Mameluke, excuse me if I'm butchering these, but that basically young girls who were perceived to be masculine were considered as such throughout their life. The Travesti, the Mino people in Benin, and so it just goes on and on. This map was super interesting to look at, and I'm sure that it is not exhaustive, but it does help us to understand that gender isn't something, or transgender isn't something that the kids just made up in 2019. In fact, transgender people, whether they were known as trans people, have existed across this globe for most of our history as humans. So now that we know that, we can talk about our history as humans and as trans folks here in the state of Texas. There's a long history of Black and brown trans folks. And throughout this presentation, those will be the people whom I'm speaking about most commonly. And it's because that's my own experience. And it's the way that I understand the world and the things that I personally know about. And so I also wanted to name that Black folks, Black queer folks, Black trans folks are not a monolith, that I'm not free of bias or understanding, but that these are the things that I've experienced as an organizer, the things that I've learned about in my work. And so we'll start with a story from Malaysia Booker. This isn't my favorite thing to talk about because it happened in the neighborhood that I grew up in Oak Cliff. But Malaysia Booker is a 22-year-old Black trans woman who was assaulted in Oak Cliff and was later found murdered in, where was that? In South Dallas in 2019. And so the reason why we'll be starting with this story is that it gets into the Cedar Springs area and some of the different spaces that LGBT communities should exist in or used to be able to exist in, and also some of the reasons for some of the disbandment and violence that has occurred in the aftermath. It's also important to note that we have always been here.
Our time to seek justice is now. If not now, when?
On May 18th, she was found dead from a gunshot to the head.
She got jumped the day after my birthday. And when she came to my house, like, what was so crazy is that after she got jumped, her spirit wasn't even broken. Like, she was broken, but Malaysia was so full of love, like you couldn't hold a real B down. There's a leak in this whole building, and my soul.
Malaysia Booker was one of 5 trans women murdered in the US so far this year. She was one of 133 killed in the last 6 years, more than 2/3 of whom were Black.
I want to see everybody's face.
Miko Hicks is a friend of Malaysia's. Do you think if the video of Malaysia getting attacked hadn't gone viral and hadn't been seen by as many people as it was, that her death would have gotten as much attention as it has?
No. No, it wouldn't have. She'd have been another trans woman that got killed. She didn't want to be public. Malaysia was terrified after this happened. What she wanted to do was let it all go.
Malaysia had reason to be afraid. Most murders of Black trans women happen in the South. But Dallas is supposed to be different. Since at least the 1970s, it's had a vibrant LGBT community concentrated in the historic neighborhood of Oak Lawn. But Oak Lawn has changed drastically over the past few years. Today, the neighborhood is 75% white, with an average income of $60,000 a year, more than twice as much as in South Dallas, where Malaysia lived. Tell me a little bit about Dallas, and specifically about being trans in Dallas.
When I first came out, probably about 20 years ago, the Cedar Springs, Oak Lawn area was covered in all kinds of people. White, Hispanic, Black, trans women all over the place. What they did to get rid of it, they knocked down everything, built these really new, expensive, high-rise apartments with the little shopping centers in the bottom of them and made everything pretty and ritzy that we couldn't afford. It makes us feel like we're not wanted anywhere. We're not wanted in the Black community. We grew up here, we live here. We're not wanted here. And now we're not wanted in the gay area either.
The Dallas police.
Okay, so after that, we understand a little bit more about Malaysia's story, but also the story of Cedar Springs and that neighborhood known as the Gayborhood in Dallas. Who you are looking at are the owners of the Elm and Pearl nightclub. It was a institution, a space where it was the first gay club that I ever went to when I was young growing up here in Dallas. And it's unfortunately no longer open, but this quote is from Glenn Hunter, one of the owners, and he says, "We never experienced racism, the racism in Oklahoma that we got in Dallas." He said, "You go out on a Friday night and you got called the N-word, and that's part of the reason why we started our bar. We got tired of people dictating where we could go out." And they said that for the first time, we had a club of our own that catered to the things that were important to us. Now, I'm talking about nightclubs and things like that for a reason, and it's because nightclubs provide more than a good time out, but an opportunity to build meaningful community connection that can result in enhanced safety. Dallas doesn't have a Black-owned LGBT club right now, but places like Marty's Live, OT Tavern, Area 511, and others create safe spaces for Black LGBT and Black trans folks to have some joy. Dallas Black LGBT community is still waiting and looking forward to a more responsive and inclusive neighborhood where folks like Miko and others can continue to exist and thrive, but also have some safety and security in a community amongst others like them. So the Oak Lawn area did make history in 2018 as the first Texas city to get state recognition for its LGBT neighborhood. And while Marsha P. and Sylvia Rivera are pictured in the Dallas neighborhood, After years of gentrification, as Miko named, and discrimination, few of their trans children can be found thriving in the same space. For those of us who are in Dallas and who are in the LGBT community, this is an opportunity for us to make that change. So after Malaysia was killed, and Mercy and Chanel and Dallas Black trans-led organizations responded. When Malaysia was killed, I have been organizing and doing different type of work within Black communities for a while, and I was able to get in contact with Robin Crow, or Pocahontas, who is my director at House of Rebirth. But before that, our communities converged to host a series of emergency community meetings. And the results of those meetings mirrored the same statistics gathered from Black trans people, and particularly Black trans women, in many of the reports that we'll name. The experiences of being unhoused, under-resourced, and socially disenfranchised were present at almost every level. It was founded by myself, Robin Crow, and Ray Nelson to be a place to serve the specific needs of Black trans women, just like Malaysia. After 4 years of advocacy, we are moving to a center concept where we'll widen resources and provide, where we can widen the resources we provide, along with widening the community served through our partnership with Link Together, which is an organization that serves trans, masculine, and non-binary folks. So super excited about that, but also I wanted to name these other groups or other organizations: BTAC, New Transgender Movement. There's a couple who have popped up here in Dallas and across the country. I think trans-led organizations are important when the populations that are being targeted are being looked into are trans themselves. Trans folks know the best things that are necessary for them. And so whenever that is possible, I always encourage that. So what about Texas? What do Texas laws and transgender rights look like in Texas? Many of us heard about Greg Abbott's recent opinion on transgender youth and the attempt to criminalize them. And although a judge has stopped this motion for the time being, it still exists as a concern within the hearts and minds of families and parents across this state. Texas is an interesting place in that in 2003, the Supreme Court officially ruled homosexuality was no longer a punishable crime. That means that within our lifetimes, for most of us, that it has been. And in places like Louisiana, Black trans women and others have been forced to register as sex offenders and face prison time due to crime against nature laws that are still in effect in places across the country and in the global South. These ways of criminalizing transgender people are not new, but have been systematic ways of trying to remove trans people from our communities as a whole. So as we move and we're talking about why, what are some of the reasons, what are some of the things that are going on and are affecting the outcomes of Black trans communities and primarily Black trans women? When we talk about the ways that this disenfranchisement has occurred, it hasn't been without consequence. And so we have to have this conversation about the underground economy and how Black trans women have been essentially forced into sex work to afford survival, many of them. The statistics show that Black trans women are represented in the underground economy, experience more so than any other demographic, according to transequality.org. Now, people in Philadelphia, New York, DC, and other places have taken actions to change the ways that sex workers are treated. And Amnesty International believes that criminal penalties for consensual sexual exchange often harm those most vulnerable while fostering violence and exploitation. They say that street-based sex workers who are engaged in survival sex work often bear the brunt of the criminalization. and that 80% of street-based sex workers experience violence in the course of their work, but also 1 in 5 have been approached by police asking them for sex. And also that folks experiencing homelessness are just trying to meet their basic needs, and that's their primary reason for being involved in this industry. Whether your morals or feelings or thoughts and ideas contrast with this effort to decriminalize sex work, it's something that we all should be considering and thinking about as the outcomes are affecting folks who are living in the margins. So how do we transform? What do we do as individuals? What do we do within our communities? What are some solutions to some of these issues? So in our workplaces, sometimes people come to House of Rebirth organizations and things like that. They want to find out, how can we help? And I'm always like, do you have an internship? Are you hiring? We need less volunteers and more trans people working and able to work in jobs that pay them living wages. There's a saying that when Black trans women are free, everyone can be free. I think we say this to mean that the intersections that Black trans women experience in the United States and in the world, when addressed and remedied, might result in justice for many more marginalized folks beyond Black trans women themselves. I think Black trans liberation in full looks like prison abolition, an end to police brutality, imperialism, and maybe even capitalism. But these are some more acute ways that we as communities and individuals can affect the changes and enhance access for everyone. So in our workspaces, the question that we have to ask is, has your company or organization approached diversity and inclusion with transgender employees in mind? Not do they care about transgender employees, or do they have a friend who's transgender, but have we approached diversity and inclusion with those folks in mind specifically? This is a quote from a survey asking trans people about their experiences in the workforce. And they said that their coworkers would gossip about me as news about my trans status spread across the workplace. I was treated significantly differently once people heard about me being trans. Coworkers felt they had the right to disrespect me because the owner set the tone, and I became a spectacle in my own workplace. So nobody works hard and contributes to an organization's success in order or wants to feel that they've been stigmatized or fearful of coming to work each day. But thousands of trans people are subjected to just that. And if they are fortunate to have been employed in the first place. And so these are some of the things that we can do to create workspaces that are trans inclusive. The first thing that you can do is mind your business. Now, what I mean by that is that there are likely things that exist in our workspaces that we've just considered as just baseline professionalism. But we have to ask the question, is this professionalism or is this a European or white cultural norm? Workplace culture that is left unchecked for bias creates barriers to inclusion. And so a good rule of thumb when making policies of any kind is to consider, is this policy integral to the work being done? Also, who does this policy or practice exclude and why? One should assume that you have bias, assume that there are things in your life or things that you see or have heard that have affected the way that you understand issues. Because if you don't assume that in the beginning, then you can't be curious and you can't be honest about how it's showing up. These questions and others invite us to find solutions that apply to many people, including GNC and trans folks. So in recent years, there has been legislation created as some Black women have resisted the burden to conform with these European beauty standards by simply allowing their hair to grow naturally or choosing culturally traditional styles. But of course, this is only the tip of the iceberg of the ways that workplace culture left unchecked for bias has created barriers to inclusion. And so if it has started with hair, We can just about imagine what it looks like for trans people entering workspaces that have not taken the intention and also measured their impact in the policies that they've created. In fact, it's important to note that impact is way more important than your intent. Maybe you've gotten it wrong before, but here's an opportunity to get it right. The Harvard Business Review's research suggests that a failure to adopt trans-specific policies and practices can cost businesses dearly in the form of high turnover rates, decreased engagement, productivity, and possible litigation. Discriminatory behavior in general also just hurts the company's brand. And it upsets me and my homegirls. Like, nobody likes that. So just maybe try to do something different in your workspace. They say that more than 3/4 of the respondents who had a job in the past year hid their gender identity at work, quit their job, or took other actions simply to avoid discrimination. The statistics are deafening and damning as it relates to some of the reasons why folks have been pushed into underground economies because of their experiences in workplaces. Imagine having to wake up and go to work as someone that you're not every day. And then also the impact of what that looks like for trans people who are asked to do the same, or who are asked to do things like use a different bathroom. Miko, who you saw in the previous clip, named that a job that she had told her that she needed to go across the street to a Subway in order to use the restroom each day at her job because she couldn't use the one assigned to the gender that she identified as. Of course, these experiences are compounded for people who hold more than one stigmatized identity, like Miko. So what are some ways that we can start to integrate this culture of inclusion into our workplaces? I like to think that gender neutral language matters a whole lot. If you provide a designated space on applications to voluntarily list pronouns and chosen names, you don't force trans people to out themselves, but you also make it a general part of the workplace experience. Using gender neutral language in handbooks and company documents also goes a long way. And make your email signature with name and pronouns policy for everyone. I can't stress this enough, but these types of policies and the ways that they are implemented allow for trans people to have some safety and security and knowing that everybody is doing it. And so it doesn't make them stick out like a sore thumb when they have an email signature and their pronouns. And then finally, leaders should take the lead. When you're introducing yourself, give your name and pronouns first to invite a new colleague to share theirs. When we get into these habits of sharing names and pronouns, we also create a culture where this isn't something that is out of the ordinary and folks can feel comfortable bringing up their differences or bringing up the ways that perhaps they identify. Finally, in the service industry, this is something that I think is important, but also within our offices. Folks want to know, how can we use gender neutral language? Well, I live in Texas, and in Dallas, we love to ma'am and sir, but instead, maybe we could try customer, client, valued guest, y'all. All of these are ways that you can talk about a group of people without gendering them. And also you can talk to your patrons or customers without misgendering them on accident. These are some additional tips for an inclusive workplace. You should consider working with racialized, GNC, and transgender and disabled people for DEI audits, workshops, and trainings. If you are trying to create trans-specific policies, it's important that trans people are present in those decisions. And it's also important that you've done this work, if possible, before hiring gender diverse people into an unprepared workplace. This doesn't mean take like a year to do this work, but that it can be better for those folks who are entering into a workspace that's already done some of the work to make sure that it can be inclusive and comfortable. You should lead with diversity, champion an inclusive workplace. Don't wait until you find out about discrimination to prevent it. You should look at your dress codes, make sure that they are open to gender diversity, be clear about your company's position on discrimination. And then also trans inclusive insurance. This is something that many people haven't thought of, but you should ask your healthcare provider about access and have HR become acquainted with trans specific resources for employees ahead of time. Have bathroom access. Gender neutral bathrooms rock. A single stall bathroom with no W or M on it is awesome. But you should also just create a policy that ensures access and train on the implementation ahead of time. This is a quote also from one of those surveys of trans folks in their work experiences. And this is about a positive experience. This person was told by their manager or their boss that you have the right to be who you are and to be treated with respect and dignity. I will do everything I can to make sure your transition is as smooth and trouble-free as it can be. And then she got busy arranging meetings with the head of departments and the head of HR. This is after she asked the questions around what it is that she needed and what it is that was necessary for them to do to make sure that that could happen. The next thing is that equitable schools, of course, starts with you, but it also starts with youth. I said that I'm a big proponent of youth autonomy and agency, and I mean it. It is important that we involve youth in decisions that impact their lives because they know their experience is best. But it's also pretty cool, I think, to realize that Generation Z is the queerest generation ever, according to a new survey, and that 1 in 6 youth in Generation Z identify as queer or transgender, but also that 1 in 3 Black LGBTQ youth identify as transgender or non-binary. And so in 2019, a 15-year-old teen in Huntsville, Alabama, took his own life after being constantly bullied at school. Why is this important? Well, the outcomes of suicide and self-harm for Black LGBT youth is nearly double that of their peers, according to research by the Trevor Project. So how will our schools and classrooms prepare to advocate for this brand new generation of so many rainbow stars? These are some of the experiences that they have had. There's a short video here, and I think in the interest of time, we're going to omit it, but I do encourage you to look at it. They talk about their bullying experiences, some of the things that they learned from them, but also some of the ways that it impacted them later on in their lives. 54% of LGBT youth say that they've been harassed because people thought that they were transgender. And 20% have dropped out or left a school because the mistreatment was so bad. When it comes to bullying, 36% have been disciplined for fighting back against bullies, and 52% were not allowed to dress in a way that fit their gender identity or expression. But 77 have 1 or more of these experiences listed. That means that a lot of youth and trans youth are being disenfranchised and don't have access to the things that they need to live their best lives. So these are some ways that we can create a more inclusive school environment, because a trans inclusive school is a safer school for everyone. So we can make our bathrooms and public spaces and our dialogue gender neutral. We can create environments with gender diversity and access centered. I would say to consider school-wide diversity trainings, excuse me, and also think about if gender neutral classrooms can help protect trans youth. In the wake of the opinion that came from Greg Abbott, this is something that I was thinking about myself as an educator, and it also is pretty similar to the types of environments that I try to create for young people already. But that if we're not having to decipher between someone's gender in a classroom, that these might create opportunities for everyone to be able to exist as their full self without any issues. You should also include LGBT and GNC people in your staffs, in your classroom, and also in your lesson plans. From math to history, pre-K to senior year, it's important to let your students know that queer and transgender people have made valuable contributions to our society. You should hire trans people, equip your counselors and educators with trans-specific resources, and support LGBT groups and clubs that spring up from the young people. And last, but definitely not least, and I think this may be one of the most important ones, is to ban bullying. Be an advocate, be clear about your stance on gender diversity, and work towards healing versus punishment. The answer to bullying shouldn't be a trip to ISS, but that we should look into using transformative justice and education to create connections amongst young people. The bully on Tuesday can be an advocate by Friday. If we're diligent and intentional about creating those connections and about helping young people to see the ways that they're different, but also the ways that they share in their own experiences. And it's important to ensure access to mental health care resources. Black LGBTQ youth experience heightened rates of suicidality similar to LGBTQ youth in general, but they are accessing professional care at lower rates. So having access to mental health care in schools, especially schools that are primarily Black and Brown, is integral to the health of trans youth and LGBT youth. So how can we take the path to heal communities and families? I think everybody is responsible for contributing to this solution, from our churches to parents and public services. When we come together to create community alongside transgender people, we can form a culture of inclusion, safety, and acceptance for us all.
So look out for her.
Okay, let me not do that. So when we are able to create that type of a community where we do have that inclusion, safety, and acceptance for us all, it means that some of these statistics will have changed. That half of LGBTQ young people and trans youth said that they feared expressing their LGBTQ identity to family members and thought that it would lead to them being evicted. And while LGBT youth make up only 7% of the total US population, they comprise almost 40% of all young people experiencing homelessness. LGBT individuals experiencing homelessness are often at heightened risk of violence, abuse, exploitation, compared with their cis and heterosexual peers. Transgender youth are at particular physical risk due to the lack of acceptance and are often turned away from shelters. In some cases, signs have been posted barring their entrance. So these statistics to me illuminate a wide array of areas that have some opportunities for us to change and to make them more inclusive and more accessible. From family dynamics to the way that public services treat trans folks and LGBT youth, we all have something to offer to the table when it comes to making a change. This next slide, you're going to see a short clip from Moni G, who was performing at a memorial that was hosted for Mercy Mack when she was killed also in 2019. I'm showing you this so that you can see what it looks like when community does come together in the aftermath of violence, and also the ways that we continue to do this work. This was also in the period of time that we worked together with TRHT for those panels that were referenced in the beginning.
So look out for her, working out of this box. I celebrate my freedom. I celebrate. Can't let the world get me down. I celebrate. I celebrate my freedom. I celebrate. Can't let the world get me down. Won't get me down. All right, follow me on can hold me down, you can hold me back. Gonna celebrate, love me where I'm at. Hopping on planes, flying through the sky. Sleeping forward, never looking back.
So this was from the memorial for Mercy Mack. This was just days after she was killed. Our communities came together to console her mother, make it clear that she was loved and that we stand in accountability to her memory. Now, who was Mercy Mack and why are we talking about this now? Well, Mercy Mack was a beautifully loved 22-year young Black woman. She was said to have a beaming personality. She was said to have a beaming personality and be the ultimate source of joy and laughter to everyone that she was around. She was loved and lavished by her family and had a full life ahead of her. Angela Walker, who was 20, had attended the same middle school and had bullied her previously for her queer identity years before she transitioned, according to family and friends. They had become involved after graduation, and the rage of this becoming public, he took her life, shooting her 10 times at point blank range in the same apartment complex her mother and older sister and 3 brothers still reside. This isn't a story of a victim and a villain, but of many missed opportunities and 2 young lives lost, a community of families forever changed with a wound in desperate need of healing. The lack of empathy and awareness and public resources resulted also in Malaysia Booker's 2019 assault a few months prior in the same zip code after a fender bender. Malaysia and Edward Thomas, who was reportedly offered $200 to beat her up, did just that. It's important to note that he's the only assailant convicted for her assault. And Edward Thomas, after spending just 300 days in jail, went on to be charged with the murder of a Black cis woman named LaShonda Wilson outside of a fast food restaurant on Ledbetter in October of 2021. This brings to mind the quote from Angela Davis, where she says, "If they come for me in the morning, they will come for you in the night." It's important to know that there is no safety in our silence. Simply because we are not currently in the line of fire, our communities must stand up for Black trans lives. I'm gonna move past this slide in the interest of time, but this is a clip of what it's like just to exist, just walking down the street, maybe going to work, grabbing a cup of coffee or some food, or going to meet a friend, and what that looks like for trans people and why that's even important. I think that many of us get up, we get ready for our day, and we never even consider some of the things that folks within my community have to, and it's important to know. So what are some things that we can do? This timeline to intercommunal healing that you will see here, it has no time and date on it. That time and date will be one that we create. When? It's a good question. Well, about 40% of LGBTQIA adults in the United States are people of color, including 12% who identify as Black. So it will be up to us in our communities, intercommunally, to solve these issues. For Black leaders in churches, the message is being shared on the pulpit and at the protest line do bleed into the fabric of our families, communities, and relationships. And everyone wins when all the members of our community are accepted and protected for who they are. Miko Hicks said in one of the interviews that she gave that Black leaders and pastors keep preaching that gay and trans is a perversion, that we're the devil, that it gives people the justification for saying that we don't need to be here. They can just hurt us and nothing will happen. We should change that, and we can change that by changing the messaging that we are giving to people in churches and within organizing communities. For parents and families, you can be equipped with education, you can model inclusion and be sources of life-saving support for cis and transgender youth alike. If you think that your youth or your young person is trans, take this opportunity to co-author the narrative of your child's experience. Be curious. Check in with them. Let Let them tell you who they are and affirm their choices. Consider the diversity of environments and people that they interact with. I need to get some water. Consider the diversity of environments and people that they interact with. Bias is learned and internalized. Let young people know that you think gender diversity is important and teach them about different family types. For popular culture gives us social cues around what is okay, from the memes that we repost to that comedian that we all know. We can create, uplift, and make space for gender diversity and education with intention. It could be a local event venue or a famous rapper, but the culture that we create impacts the lives for already deeply marginalized members of our communities, and they have lived consequences. So we share in this opportunity to change the culture and create respect in our actions. And finally, youth and adult resources. Public resources that work to ensure accessibility for trans people in our community, strengthen the security of those facing intersections of oppression. So as we close, I hope that this has given you a good breadth of information around trans communities and particularly POC trans communities. And I'm going to be closing with a poem that I wrote in 2019. And occasionally as an artist and a consultant and a slew of other things, I feel conflicted. Like I'm two different people. Is this the right moment? My spirit knows what must be said, and fear wonders, will it make people angry or uncomfortable? Will people not want to support us if I speak my truth? I don't know the answer, but I do know that it's a privilege in and of itself to only have to wonder. And so with that, I share with you Unavailable, a call to action. I have been mad, been ready to fight, to riot in the streets, to write dissertations on another dismembering of Black freedom. Since it stood tall before the coffin ships named Jesus, I have been enraged to tears and irreconcilable anger, but this time, the tears cannot come. The well is dry. Water is exhausted from the memorials our Black masses ignore. Too many Black women get killed by the police and it is silent. Too many Black trans people get killed by the police and it's quiet. Dying senselessly from our captors' infections because we constantly miss the connection. White supremacy is patriarchy. Black girls be told to choose the boot to their necks and choose the hue of the person doing the harming nonetheless. We both die quiet and populate the protest front lines. No one thinks to ask if we are blind or trying to prove our worth or if it will never work. Maybe next lynch, we'll call in sick. Take a personal day to recall the records and read receipts totaling up our oppression in the form of lessons for the other Blacks, not eligible for dreams of justice, whose right to life is denied, like Malaysia Booker and Tony McDade, like Breonna Taylor agreed to with public antipathy. See, I am livid now, but I lack capacity, for I have marched and chanted with matriarchal martyrs, hearts gaping open for solace, to be guardian's angel, while my children burning with righteous fury dance with death. I have risked life, withstood tear gas, rubber bullets, and sleepless nights. I have traveled this godforsaken country to avenge many a Black man's death, learning more each time. Few, if any, would be willing to do the same for my own killing, and still I go, afraid we will be lost in the hashtags deemed irrelevant because you cannot remember the last time I cried for you. Because some bodies are born into suicidal ideation and at the very precipice of horizontal and vertical subjugation, these bodies have not been laid to rest in power, but instead in ire and degradation. So this time, I am not prepared for another rewind. This record is broken and moving too quickly to notice this flaw in its mind, how it reacts in the key of its own misgivings. the one that does not truly see trans or cis women and any non-man as worthy of living, but wish for uprisings on their own behalf. Reporting live from the latest fatal forecast. The devil is in the details of our mutual demise. I will not fight for a future where I still must live in lives with pure hearts, whose humanity is placed second, third, or holistically denied. No.
We are black people.
While I am sorry, I am unavailable.
See, we look at these things like acceptance and tolerance, and we don't realize how degrading it is. You're already putting yourself in a pedestal above another human being, and we are supposed to be equal. So therefore, I don't need you to accept me. I may want you to understand me, but as far as you accepting me, that just means that I believe that you are greater than I am, or I believe that you have some kind of privilege or authority over my life, and no way.
Okay, well, thank you so much for listening. I'm going to close us out with Stand Up. I hope that it inspires you to take that information that you learned throughout this presentation and also those words that I shared at the end, and think about how you can impact the lives of trans people in your community, in your family, in your church home, and create a more inclusive and happier and more beautiful world for us all. Oh, that didn't work.
I've been walking with my face turned to the sun. Weight on my shoulders, a bullet in my gun. Oh, I got eyes in the back of my head, just in case I had to run. I do what I can when I can, while I can for my people. While the clouds roll back and the stars fill the night, that's when I'm gonna stand up, take my people with me. Together we are going to a brand new home, far across the river. Can you hear freedom calling, calling me to answer? Gonna keep on keeping on. I can feel it in my bones. Early in the morning, before the sun begins to shine.
All right, I hope you go and watch that. I love this performance and I love this song. It always empowers me to my next step. I'm gonna pass it to Jerry Hawkins to close. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day and all of that. Thank you. Oh, also, if you have questions or anything that you would like to ask me specifically, you can email at xdustei@gmail.com, and also check trans resources at houseofrebirth.org.
Thank you so much, X, for that amazing presentation. I learned so much. I hope that you all were taking notes. We are going to follow up this webinar with a workshop. So stay tuned for what we do at the intersection of race, racism, and transgender lives. We have a lot of work to do to make our communities more inclusive and safe, safer, because I don't believe in safe spaces as long as these systems of oppression exist for our communities. So stay tuned. Follow us on dallastrht.org and dallastrht on social media. This presentation will be posted on our YouTube page, and we will, if you have any questions, please send it to us at info@dallastrht, and any suggestions on any follow-up Transformation Tuesday conversations, please send it to us. We really appreciate you, and it's great having you all, and thank you again.